Hello, in this video I'm going to talk about equipment. This is a guide, so there's no gameplay, and I'm mainly doing this one as a sort of preface to my content as I do equipment sort of recommendations in my website reviews, and also I'm starting to do a few more commentary reviews on this channel, so this is just for that really. I'll try to be quick and go through them. This video will let you equip every single tank in the game to the best possible setup for you, but it won't be recommending you actual equipment to use. So there's sort of five methods to equip the tank. The first is a bad setup, second, sweaty tryhard setup, third, min-maxing setup, fourth, balanced setup, and fifth, personal preference setup. So I'll go through each of them. So firstly, there's the bad setup. This is probably a setup which casual players use, players who just play the game every now and then and aren't actually too invested in their stats or how the game is quote unquote meant to be played. They're just here to play the game when they have time, and they don't really care about anything else. There's nothing wrong with a bad setup, but if you want to improve as a player, it's better to take recommendations from the other four types of methods of equipping your tank, such as a sweaty tryhard setup, for example, and use those to become better at the game, as it will help your tank be stronger. For example, a bad setup would be using enhanced armor on the Gorilla 15, or for example the FV4005, as these two tanks basically have less than 30mm of frontal armor. So nothing wrong with a bad setup, but if you want to get better at the game, don't use it, because you are putting yourself at a sort of handicap compared to players who do use the correct and better setups. So next is the sweaty tryhard setup. This is a method of equipping the tank which uses only the best possible equipment, the most meta equipment, the equipment that makes your tank the strongest it can be in battle. And generally commonly associated with a sweaty tryhard setup is calibrated shells, refined gun main drive, these three main ones, and then of course either of these works. It depends on the tank you're playing. And there's nothing wrong with a sweaty tryhard setup either. This setup is used to be the best possible tank, basically, to win more, to get more damage, to always be able to deal with enemies in the most effective possible way for that tank. However, this won't work for all players, as if you're a newer player, for example, you might not have the skill, the map knowledge, the sort of experience in the game to be able to fully utilize this most meta sweaty tryhard sort of equipment setup. So yeah, that's basically just for getting the best possible stats and winning the most. Generally, the best players will use a sweaty tryhard sort of setup because it makes their tank the best, the most competitive. This doesn't necessarily mean this is the best way to set up your tank, and I'll get into that at the end of the video. It's just one of the methods that you can use to set up the tank. The third method of setting up the tank is min-maxing, and this is prioritizing in the strengths of the tank and making them stronger, while basically ignoring the weaknesses. So just as an example, you have the Hori Type 3 with the highest possible penetration in game due to having standard AP and premium AP shells. So this tank, if you were to min-max it, you would not use gun rammer, you would use calibrated shells, as it has the best penetration in game. Also, comparing its DPM to its penetration, when you take them and look at the entirety of tier 10 tank destroyers, the DPM is much more unimpressive compared to its penetration, so the penetration is the strength, it's the part you want to maximize. Now, when thinking about min-maxing your tank, you have to think, what's the point of playing this tank if I'm not min-maxing? On many tanks, there's not too much reason for either side, whether you want to have a min-maxed build or a balanced build, but on some tanks you have to think about, well, if I'm not min-maxing, then why am I playing this tank? For example, you could compare the Ho-Ri and the Guerrilla 15. These two have fairly similar guns, and if they're playing in a sniping playstyle, they can be considered quite similar tanks. But the Guerrilla is just better at sniping. It's got more DPM, more alpha damage, better accuracy, better shell velocity. It's just a lot better in many ways. Meanwhile, all the Ho-Ri has is penetration, so if I'm not improving its penetration, then why play the Ho-Ri, really? Again, this doesn't necessarily mean it's the best way to equip the tank, and I'll get into that with the sort of balanced setup in a minute. But another example of min-maxing would be using the Guerrilla 15. This tank has great DPM, so you could min-max by improving its DPM with gun rammer. This tank also has great shell velocity, so supercharger works to min-max. However, its aim time is the best of any tier 10 tank destroyer, so enhanced gun laying drive is also min-maxing. This tank has amazing dispersion, so refined gun, that's min-maxing. And I'll use the Guerrilla 15 as an example in a minute, again with balanced, since this tank works very well. One more example I want to give is the WZ-111-5A. This tank is well known for its low penetration. A lot of players don't like it for this reason. However, if you think about it, what's the point of playing the WZ-111-5A if you're just going to improve its penetration to be the same level as another heavy tank? The point of this tank is that it has good alpha damage with great DPM. If you're throwing that away by using calibrated shells, then really, what's the point of playing the WZ-111-5A? I could go play an Object 777 with similar sort of DPM. I could play an Object 260 with better DPM and similar mobility. So it's just, you have to think about, why would I play this tank if I'm not min-maxing? On a lot of tanks it doesn't matter, but on some of them, for example the 5A, it does matter. So next, getting into the balanced sort of equipment setup method. This is the complete opposite of min-maxing. You take the worst stats and you improve them at the cost of the best stats. So on the Guerrilla 15, you would use vertical stabilizer for a balanced build. Because this has terrible gun stabilization, you would try and reduce that by using vertical stabilizer. And if you look at dispersion, you'd say, well, it's already the best in tier 10, so I don't need refined gun. I'm going to reduce its strength in order to improve its weakness, which is exactly this. Another example of this would be the Ho-Ri. You could say, well, this tank already has the best penetration in tier 10, so why would I use calibrated shells? I'll improve its DPM because it needs that more than the penetration. So that's the sort of balanced build. You're trying to level off the strengths and the weaknesses so they're a bit more even. And again, back to the 5A, just like I explained just now, you take away from the DPM to improve its low penetration so it has more sort of average tier 10 heavy tank levels. And now you've leveled off the stats to be sort of more balanced and good in all situations. And generally, on my reviews and equipment setups, I'll recommend at least one type of balanced build, because this is the one that works easiest and best for the majority of players in the majority of situations. This doesn't mean it's the best possible setup, since it won't always work in all situations, but it is the best one for the most situations. And finally, I'll get into the way you should equip all tanks in the game, and the best possible way to equip them, which is personal preference. So this is a combination of the second, third and fourth methods of equipping the tank, which are the sweaty tryhard setup, the min-max setup and the balanced setup. So personal preference is how you should equip every single tank in the game, based on your personal preference. Don't listen to me or other content creators for how you should equip your tank. You can use that as a recommendation to get started with, you know, a sort of starting point on how to play the tank, how to equip it, but don't listen to us content creators all the way, because your personal preference will be different to ours. How you play the tank will vary depending on what you like on the tank, what positions you like to use on the map, what sort of a meta you enjoy, and of course how you want to use that equipment. So for example, for me, my personal preference on the 5A is to use gun rammer because I like to min-max the DPM. However, I want to use refined gun because I want the tank to be better in that area. So min-maxing on the gun rammer, but sweaty tryhard on the refined gun. And then I've gone with a sort of balanced build on the refined gun as well, because the tank already has great gun handling, but less impressive dispersion. So you can see the sort of choices behind on that tank. And in terms of personal preference, again, for the AMX M445, calibrated shells for a sweaty tryhard build, because this is what works, this is what makes the tank the best. But then my personal preference of vertical stabilizer, because I like having faster aim time on all of my guns. And I'll give one more sort of example for this, which will be the 183. But this tank, the 183, previously I used gun rammer. That was my personal preference because I really liked having the faster reload, because I played this tank on a second line and there was sort of pressure of reloading faster, though generally people would go with calibrated shells. And I previously also liked to use refined gun because the tank had fairly good aim time and gun handling. However, now my personal preference is to switch both of these, now using calibrated shells, which is the sweaty tryhard setup, because this is the better equipment choice, especially now with the changes the tank has got. And now switching from refined gun to vertical stabilizer because I prefer the faster aim time since the tank had a big nerf. So yeah, personal preference. This depends on how you like to play the tank, how you want to set it up, how you want to use the stats that the tank has, its strengths, its weaknesses, what positions you go to on the map, all of that combined into one sort of equipment choice, which takes all the first few methods of equipping and putting it together. And of course, for personal preference, this is applied to all tanks since it is how you would want to play them. And of course there's no way to get a personal preference without first playing the tanks yourself and trying out different pieces of equipment. So it's best to just try out sort of different builds and see what you like on the tank, what works for you, and that sort of thing. So as an example, for me as a player, I like having DPM, a faster reload. I like using vents on a lot of autoloaders, especially after the vents buff. And I also like having faster aim time, so I generally use vertical stabilizer over refined gun. But of course, on some other tanks, I use refined gun over vertical stabilizer because of their stats, and you sort of have to try it out to feel sort of what's best on a certain vehicle. But yeah, that's it for equipment. Use your personal preference to set up your tanks. Don't just listen to better players, to people who have sort of varying opinions, or us content creators. You have to try it for yourself to be able to get the best possible setup for you. Thanks for watching.